Hello, everyone, and welcome to the final week of the pandemic, science, and society. Sadly, not the last week of the actual pandemic, but hopefully we are moving towards that and working together as a collective to make the situation better. And on that note, our first guest speaker today is Dr. Colin Ennis, a psychologist with a private practice in Chicago, Illinois. Dr. Ennis provides mental health services to individuals through his practice with an emphasis on care for members of the LGBTQ community and other marginalized groups, and in particular for individuals who have intersecting identities across multiple groups. He will be talking to us today about mental health during COVID and LGBTQ plus concerns. Welcome, Dr. Ennis.
Thank you, Krista. I appreciate it. I'm very glad to be here. Students, I received the questions you sent in. Excellent questions. I'm going to have Krista ask me some of them and provide you information. And then we're also going to try to leave time for additional Q&A based on information that I've shared later today. So with that, Krista, take it away.
Yes. Thank you. So yeah, this topic is of particular concern, I think, for a lot of our students. And, you know, sadly on our campus, we've lost members of our campus community because of the toll the mental health crisis during this pandemic has taken. So when we're thinking about the intersections of mental health and COVID-19, what are the most common mental health problems that arise?
All right, so I'll start with some general statistics to give people lay of the land. We don't really have a lot of peer-reviewed hard data. It's too soon for that, but we have some. We do know that right now, 1/3 of Americans are feeling severe anxiety, and this is according to the Census Bureau's survey. And the Kaiser Family Foundation found that the pandemic has negatively affected the mental health of at least 50% of adults. And in April, text to a federal government agency, mental health line went up 1,000%. Yeah, these are big, big numbers. And the situation is particularly dire for certain vulnerable groups. We'll get into marginalized groups later, but I'm thinking right now of healthcare workers, people who have had COVID with severe cases, who have lost loved ones to COVID, are all at the most risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder, which I'll talk more about later. So the most common ways that the pandemic has been affecting mental health has been by far anxiety. And I'll say more about that later. Next is depression. I'll say more about that in a little bit as well. Substance abuse to manage anxiety and depression is also on the uptick. Alcohol sales have gone through the roof around the country, as well as at the cannabis dispensaries in states where that's legal. People with PTSD are struggling the most. PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is a disorder that occurs when people have been exposed to life-threatening trauma. And what they experience is a lot of symptoms of high anxiety, increased fearfulness, hyperarousal, hypervigilance, avoiding anything that reminds them of what happened in a way that interferes with their life. Obsessive compulsive disorder is on the uptick. It starts out because it makes sense. It makes sense to be washing your hands like crazy, to be avoiding people. But then the problem is once that's no longer necessary, there are going to be people that are still doing this forever. Same with agoraphobia, the fear of leaving one's home. And then finally, suicidal ideation is also on an uptick. So the reason that people are having so much distress is, you know, there's like with the anxiety, there's fear there. So people are literally scared for their lives on a day-to-day basis, but they're also afraid of a loss of control in society that helps us get through the day and allows us to get things done. We know that a sense of control is an illusion, as this is proving to us all, but we still really need it in order to be able to focus on what do we want to get done in our lives. I can't think of how many people have told me as a mental health practitioner, I just need to know how long this is going to take. I don't care if this takes 2 or 3 years, just tell me now and I can do it. So the fact that we don't have any control and we don't have a clear message is really, really making people very anxious and having a hard time getting out of their heads and stopping the worry cycle that they get into. And the news, of course, is not helping. The second is the depression. And a lot of this is coming from the loneliness and isolation that so many of the students had in questions about in what was submitted to me. Human beings are not designed to do this. We are very social animals. We are not designed to spend time alone. This is nowhere near like solitary confinement. So I'm not going to use that as a direct example, but we know when we put people in solitary confinement, we cause permanent brain damage to how they relate to people. And so people, essentially, we are not people if we're not in relation to other human beings. We're not our full self. So we're not designed to do this. 1 or 2 months of this we could pull off, but going into 5-6 months with no clear sign about when this is going to end is really hurting people. And the data I'll get into a little bit later show that people are deteriorating more rapidly now in this sense than they were even a few months ago. And the people that are suffering the most are the people that live alone. And this is people of all ages, people in their 20s that live alone versus people in nursing homes who are isolated to their rooms are suffering with the most depression. Another big reason for the suffering is the lack of stimulation. The two of the things that we're most driven to do as human beings are, one, relate to other people, and two, seek out new and exciting things. That's actually our deepest urge, like our deepest need. It showed up, many, millions of years ago. This seeking need was what got us to get out and get food and find shelter. And now that we have that secured, this need is now entertainment, the arts, sports, intellectual pursuits, all these things that we can't do now, and we have to do this alone. So that's what's really getting getting people down as well. And if you think about it, there's also a grief epidemic accompanying this. As of today, we're over 183,000 deaths in the US. And you have to think about how many people are mourning these people. If we were to choose a random number, say on average 24 people are really affected by each one of these deaths. That's 4.5 million people in acute grief right now. Sometimes without the ability to have really culturally important mourning rituals. Elaborate funeral people are required from all over the world are required to gather. And they're also doing this without any acknowledgement of their grief and pain from our leadership, which makes this all the more painful to not be getting comfort. And like I said earlier, they're also being asked to do this. We're also being asked to do this for far too long.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing from you is that some of the factors that are specific to COVID-19 that are related to these health issues are things like fear, lack of control, isolation, grief. Is that right?
Yes, that's exactly what I was saying. Yes. Yeah.
So do these different mental health concerns that exist around COVID and also these factors that are contributing to them, do they differ between different demographic groups?
They do, and there's more information on that from a recent study by the CDC than I can give you, but I'll go through some basics of what I've been able to find. So we know that mental health is deteriorating across the board since the spring, so that's for everyone. But there are people that are struggling more based on certain demographic things. For instance, if we look at education, people with high school degrees or less are struggling more than the other brackets. In terms of race and ethnicity, Blacks and Latinos, according to, I should have said, a CDC study done a month ago, race and ethnicities, Blacks and Latinos are suffering mentally more than other races. I was surprised that Asian Americans were not in there. In this study, it actually said they were experiencing far fewer mental stressors than Blacks and Latinos. Because some information I heard earlier in the summer said Asian Americans were suffering pretty badly, largely due to President Trump trying to pit people against Asian Americans and use this virus to stir up xenophobia. So I'd heard anecdotally from many of my friends that anti-Asian remarks and incidents had spiked earlier in the summer. In terms of income, people that earn $25,000 or less a year are having more psychological problems. In terms of employment, essential workers, understandably, are having far more problems across the board. And when I say problems, the CDC was asking people about anxiety, depression, both substance abuse, post-traumatic stress disorder, and suicidal ideation, and maybe having a combination of at least 2 or 3 of those all at the same time. So essential workers are struggling really hard. People with previous mental health difficulties are struggling really hard, and people who had pre-existing post-traumatic stress disorder, they were reporting far more distress than every single group. I mean, every other type of demographic. They were far above that. So they're really struggling right now. Unpaid caregivers, so anyone right now who's charged with raising a child or taking care of a parent in all of this, is really struggling right now. They were actually, after PTSD, they were right up there for just the amount of stress that's on them right now. Sadly, they did not inquire about ability status or LGBT identities, so which is something we'll talk more about later with a different question. So I can't tell you about that. Not mentioned, but important, they didn't single out health workers. I'd really like to know how health workers are doing, because anecdotally, the stories I'm hearing are nurses that used to work in wards that had maybe 2 deaths a year are having 2 deaths every single day and are experiencing extreme post-traumatic stress disorder as a reaction. And then finally, in terms of age group, actually the age that was experiencing the most distress by far was 18 to 24-year-olds. And I want to get back to that. But what I wanted to say was, if you look at this data, it really lays bare how much people are suffering due to inequities. We're talking people without money, people with jobs that they have to go to and can't work from home. And what we knew about them was, even before this, marginalized populations their mental health was more at risk due to a number of factors. There's institutional prejudice and systemic racism, homophobia, xenophobia, everything, able-bodied bias. Marginalized populations also tend to have a lack of access to care, meaning it's just not there. I'm thinking, for example, here in Chicago, we used to have 8 community mental health centers in the entire city, which is appalling, that's how few. And our last mayor came in and got rid of half of them. So people that had to struggle to get help then have to struggle to get it more now. And if they want a community health center, they have to start their own in their neighborhood. It's on them to do it. And so they need the money and the know-how and the legal help to get that done. So not only is there lack of access to care for marginalized populations, there's a lack of access to informed care. These people are often deeply mistreated in the healthcare system. So even if they do find the courage to go and tell a doctor everything, they're oftentimes dismissed and sent home. And then we've also found that, this is shameful to admit, but the American Psychological Association found that even people that are calling, people of color that are calling private practitioners are much less likely to get a call back than when white people call. So if somebody calls and their name or their voice signals to the person that they might be a person of color, there's a significantly lower chance that they're gonna get a call back from that person. And then finally, many cultures have stigma regarding mental health that people have to overcome. Even without all of these societal barriers, they were raised to act tough, and that looking for help was a problem, was an indication of weakness.
That's all really important, and I'm glad you bring up all of those different points, because one of the themes throughout this class has been that we don't know what each other is going through, and so we need to be treating each other with kindness, realizing that our own experience is not the same as everyone else's in this pandemic. And I think you point out some really important areas to consider. Socioeconomic status for those people making less than $25,000 a year, that's different than the average WashU family, for example. And so it's important for us to be thinking about that, thinking about people with PTSD, people who are working in jobs where they don't have the same flexibility that some of the rest of us do. So I'm glad you're bringing all of that into light, because it helps build this idea that we're working on about how we can treat each other with kindness and be gentle. And I think, you know, the picture that you paint is a difficult one because that's what the data show. And as someone who's working in private practice during this pandemic, I'm sure that's what you're experiencing with the people that you work with. So I think, you know, that's very difficult. And so seeing a light at the end of the tunnel has been so important for some people, like thinking about when this is going to end. And so I guess a question that's important is kind of thinking about that whenever that happens. What does that mean in terms of the mental health issues that have been caused by this pandemic? Are we suddenly going to see those disappear, or is this something we're going to be dealing with for a long time?
I want to hold off on that question. I want to say one more thing and then cover one more thing. I wanted to highlight what you're saying about the importance of remembering who's actually out there and what's actually going on, because we know when this happens, things like this happen, the news media does not show us what's actually happening. We see lines of, at least in Chicago, we see lots of photographs of lines of white people getting nasal swabs in their cars at Northwestern, but we don't see hospitals on the South Side where they have patients lying, you know, Black patients lying in beds on the floor in hospitals. So, hi, Andlehead.
Andlehead makes an appearance in the course.
Does it happen? Okay.
This is the first time, actually. Oh, she's been in pictures, but.
Okay. So they don't show the real picture, the real toll of who's actually suffering from. So I'm glad you brought that up. And one thing that I wanted to circle back to before we got to that next question was exactly why 18 to 24-year-olds are suffering more than any other age groups. I figured that would be really, really important for this group to hear. So the first thing to point out about 18 to 24-year-olds is that while you are legally an adult at 18, neurologically, you are not an adult until your mid-20s, which means that until you're about 24 or 25, a certain part, the frontal cortex, the frontal part of this amazing neocortex that we have is not fully online. And that part of the brain is required for impulse control, frustration tolerance, and risk aversion. And if you look at those things, those are all the three things that we're being asked to exercise the most, to be really risk averse, to tolerate a lot of frustration, and to really, really control our impulses. And people that are 18 to 24, their brain does not do that anywhere near as naturally as it will in several years from now. So it's important to keep that in mind. The next theory about why they're suffering so much is that this is a period of so many first times. So the first time you experience something, it's completely natural that your feelings are going to be more intense than when it happens to you for the second or third time. And think about, I mean, because this is a period of rapid fire milestones. This is separating yourself from your parents and deciding who your friends are and who you are as a result of who your friends are. Moving away, maybe choosing a career path. This may be your first love, your first heartbreak, the first death of a peer, not somebody who is older than you. Determining how safe the world is to be alone in, and who you are in your adult relationships. So these rapid fire milestones, and if you combine all this, it's one of the most critical periods in most people's lives. And there's this thing called the reminiscence bump. And what that is that beginning around age 10, your memories become increasingly more vivid and your feelings increasingly more strong until it peaks around age 20, where it gradually decreases and the intensity of memory and the intensity of feeling decreases to about age 30. So 18 to 24-year-olds are right in the peak of this period of neurological intensity, affective and cognitive intensity. In addition, they haven't had the chance to develop two protective factors right now. They haven't had a chance to develop a lot of their adult coping mechanisms for grief and stress. And ideally, they're healthy ones, not booze and pot. So they haven't had a chance to develop those, which you only learn through experience like this. So this is their chance to do this. And it's a really unfair one. And also they don't have life experience to put things in perspective. I remember early on I was reading an interview. A young journalist was interviewing a lot of older people about the pandemic and how bad it was. And their attitude was very, very different. You know, they've lived through World War II, Korean War, Vietnam War. These are Americans. They lived through Gulf War I, 9/11, Gulf War II, still going on, and any other number of national tragedies and you know, tsunamis and hurricanes. And their attitude was very much like, oh yeah, from time to time this stuff happens. You know, yeah, oh yeah, you'll have a pandemic every once in a while. So with the wealth of experience gives you perspective. And so to put it all in context, this development is all being put on hold, and I want to stress that it's being put on hold unnecessarily and for far too long by inadequate national response from the very top, which is my way of saying that you have to do all this and it is not fair, but this is what's being put on us anyway, and it's not necessary either. So
Absolutely.
I wanted to say that, and then, well, do you want to add anything?
No, I mean, I think absolutely. On the first day of this class, we talked about how it didn't have to be like this and it doesn't have to be like this. And I'm so glad that you said, you know, that it's unfair that the students in this class are dealing with this in the age group that they're in, because it is absolutely unfair. So thank you for saying that.
Yes, and also I will at some point try to do a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel. I promise. I've tried. It's not easy with the data, but I promise that. But so let's continue.
Yes. So going back to the question of when this is all over, the light at the end of the tunnel, is it just better?
It's just better. Let me find my answers for that one. If this disaster is like most other disasters, there will be long-term mental health consequences for the people who had COVID, know someone who died, and everyone else suffering the stress right now. The closest comparison that we have any real psychological data on is the SARS outbreak in 2002. That's the most similar type of disaster. So for those who don't remember or weren't born yet, maybe, SARS was a similar respiratory syndrome that ripped through Hong Kong. But it was over a course of 3 months. A few hundred people were infected, and a little less than 100 died, making it, you know, far more deadly than COVID is. So 4 years later, after the SARS epidemic, what Chinese researchers found was that people who had SARS had an active psychiatric diagnosis, most commonly PTSD or depression, and some felt frequent psychosomatic pain. Others were obsessive compulsive. So we have to look at that data and think about a couple things. One, this is way more than 3 months for this country. And I can only really speak to the mental health of this country because so many other countries have this under control and people are not as scared or isolated as we are here, which is just, I'm just so shocked I'm saying this about the United States, but it's true. So this is way more than 3 months, and the death toll is going to be hundreds of thousands, meaning there are going to be millions of people struggling mentally as a result of the pandemic. And the secondary health effects will long outlast the pandemic itself. After natural disasters, we almost always see uptakes in depression, anxiety, PTSD, substance abuse, child abuse, domestic violence. All of those tend to peak afterwards. Sometimes after most of the danger is, you know, over. And following disasters, the damage to mental health usually ends up costing more than the damage to physical health, literally. And we are not in a good setup right now. We don't have the mental health capacity for the tens of millions of people that are going to have severe mental health diagnoses after this. And the CARES Act from a few months ago, out of all the money in it, 1/50th of 1% was earmarked for mental health. And the sources of stress from this disaster are, why this disaster is going to be more stressful than a lot of other ones, is that most disasters are localized, meaning that it happens in one space at one moment in time, and we can say, hey, it's not safe here, go here. Or everyone here is safe. But we don't have that with this. There are no safe zones. with this disaster, which is a huge layer of stress. And another one is that the pandemic is invisible and the timeline is ambiguous. It's not like a hurricane where we can say where it's going to be on Wednesday and where it's going to be on Thursday and where to be and where not to be and when it's going to be over. We don't know where the virus is. We don't know where it's lingering. We usually oftentimes don't know who has it. And most people that haven't been lucky enough to take this course don't know what to do not to get it. They're not sure if they can ride the subway or the bus or an Uber. They don't know. Like I said, it's ambiguous, which makes it harder for people to be resilient, which we will talk about coming up. And then another stress about this is in mental health, when we work with people with PTSD, we're talking about survivors, fires, accidents, war, and frequently the best tool we have in our arsenal as we're working with them is the ability to comfort them by reminding them that it's not still going on. Like telling a vet that who's having a flashback, it's like, you're in Chicago now, you're safe. And I can't do that. We can't do that. We can't say to people, you are safe. So another problem with this is that it's upending how people typically respond to psychological disasters. Because typically what we would tell people is everyone meet at this intersection. We're giving out food and water and we're doing screenings and checks, and we can't congregate people anywhere easily in the same way, and while keeping the responders and everybody safe. And also psychological first aid workers can't do what they usually do, which is literally walk around the streets and stop people on corners and ask, how are you doing? And making sure they're getting connected to resources. So as treatment for this, most therapists, myself included, have gone online, and teletherapy can be just as effective as in-person treatment, but there's still the accessibility issue. Do people have access to technology? Do they have time, and do they know how to use it? I'm thinking particularly elderly people that have been hit the hardest with the isolation, have the hardest time using the teletherapy, as relatively simple as it seems to us. So ideally, we'd have, a coordinated, cool-headed, honest message from government officials and public health experts. We haven't had that. The president hasn't done it. WHO has gone back and forth on a few things. Same with CDC. They'll put something out and they'll kind of go quiet for a bit, put something out. But despite this, the basic principles, which we'll talk about in a second for how to take care of yourselves, are going to be the same. We're going to talk about calming yourself, self-efficacy, connectedness, hope, and a sense of safety. Those are the five things. And then finally, we need to have people doing mental health screenings with every single COVID test that we're giving, which is unscalable with the infrastructure we have right now for mental health.
Yeah, that all sounds really important. And I mean, wow, the idea of a mental health screening while getting a test seems ideal, and yet we're having trouble even just getting the test done.
And there are very effective questionnaires that are only 4 questions that people can answer in 90 seconds that can help us discern who needs what.
That's great. I mean, I think that so much of some of the conversation that's existed around testing, I feel like could be better dealt with by just a conversation with the person you're testing, right? Like telling them just because you get a negative test doesn't mean you're totally safe to go do whatever you want now. And
right.
Talking to them about their mental health and all of these things. So I think those are great points. And I want to, so you've mentioned 18 to 24-year-olds. You've also mentioned some challenges for older populations. And that's great because students have really been interested in how this is affecting different age groups, in particular, the younger age groups and the older age groups. So we've heard a lot about schools opening. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how COVID is uniquely impacting elementary school aged children.
Sure thing. So first and foremost, above all, what I'm hearing from my colleagues in development and education is that COVID is laying bare more than ever and exacerbating the inequalities in our education system. Not everyone has equal access to technology and computers to do school online. Professional parents children of professional parents likely have parents that are working from home, which is stressful for everyone, as we saw in the data, but working class parents may still have to leave the house. And a lot of these kids are just falling off the radar. I mean, literally, they're just disappearing, and the teachers don't know where they are and can't find them. Also, not having school in person means that students are lacking access to school supports, like facilities, like libraries, music, PE. I don't know what on earth you're going to do with PE with kids online. A big part of the problem is that, you know, learning online for young children is decidedly non-optimal. Learning online for older adults can be quite enriching if it's done well, but not for children. You know, I'm hearing from teachers that spring was a disaster because elementary school teachers have no experience teaching online, and there's no clear guide on how to do this right for children. So the fall may be better because they have time to plan, but once again, access is still the problem. And teaching online doesn't allow teachers to do best practices, which means direct instruction, modeling and guiding practice. Think about how important it was in first grade for your teacher to put her hand on your hand and teach you how to draw a letter or a number, or for them to walk around and make you say a word to them, so that make sure that they know that you're getting the word right, and then have, you know, one-on-one interactions with you very, very easily. And they also can't do the choral responding, which is really, really important for student engagement. So some kids are gonna be fine with this, kids that have resources, and others, the ones that need more direct instruction, are gonna have a harder time. The kid that needs to be, you know, given tasks to do so they can get their energy out, like, hey, run this note down to the principal real quick and come back, just so they can get the energy out and get them more concentrated. Teachers aren't going to be able to do that as easily. Another problem is schools, especially schools in the cities, are social work sites, which means that students there get occupational therapy, speech therapy, there's food distribution, clothing distribution, and you have social workers that are actually actively monitoring the mental health of students. And the school may be one of the safest and most regular place for students. So in terms of the long-term effects on young children, problems, you know, many children are going to be resilient, but the main problem is going to be making sure children keep up with certain critical windows. One of which, because a lot of the questions were about elementary school age children, and one of those windows happens in third grade. Up until third grade, you're spending all your class time learning how to read. And in third grade, they start throwing some math, you know, times tables in there. But you have to make sure that kids have learned to read well by third grade, because in fourth grade, you make a transition that you don't learn to read, you read to learn. So fourth grade is when first time like a history textbook finally gets in your hand. And so you have to make sure that the reading is up to par. And if students can't read, and if they're still counting on their fingers by fourth grade is going to be a real struggle. And once again, many students are going to be fine with this, but it's students of marginalized populations that have suffered the most. Last thing I'm going to say is, if you talk to the kids, they're saying that this is really stressful. All the things that they liked about school are gone. You know, there's no recess, there's no lunchtime, and there's no peer bonding. And peer bonding among children is critical for social development. It's, you know, so like all mammals play. And, you know, kids play, adults play, all mammals play. And if you watch like rats play or cats play or dogs play, you know that they take turns. It's all about dominance. They take turns pouncing on one another and running away, and they chase each other, and they go back and forth. And human children are the same. With, you know, if you watch little kids play, it's frequently one of them is teacher and the other one is student. Somebody's up here and someone's on here. There's cops and there's robbers. It's always about some kind of dominant thing. And what children have to learn is what's called the 60-40 rule, which is if you're not willing to abdicate your authority at least 40% of the time, kids are going to stop playing with you. So it teaches you have to have some degree of equanimity in order to maintain social contact. And that's a really, really important lesson that happens in person at schools, on the playgrounds, in unstructured time. And so that is, that's getting hampered right now. Another thing. Well,
Sorry,
good.
I was just going to say that's amazing. I didn't realize that, and that points to things that we're not even thinking about that are so important.
Yeah, and again, it's true. That's true for all mammals, that they have to learn. I've got to give up the power 40% of the time. Another thing is everything is harder over Zoom, especially for kids. Little kids don't get the same amount out of staring at a screen as an adult does. They're feeling sad and anxious. Teachers also feel like the expectations were already way too high for children on how to sit still for 6 to 7 hours to begin with. And now expecting them to sit that long in front of a computer is impossible. It's just not going to happen. And sitting on a computer all day is terrible for children. So the overall gist seems to be that it's too soon to say. The data isn't in yet, and kids are very resilient. Kids, psychologically, kids survive whatever you put at them. They're amazing that way. And many will be fine. But without access to enough resources, many are going to suffer disproportionately.
Yeah, that makes sense. So something that you mentioned that the students are interested in is this 4-question questionnaire, I guess, that you could do to check in on your mental health. You might not have that up right now, but maybe we could share that on our course website at some point. Students are interested in if they can do a self-check on that as they're doing their screenings for campus and that sort of thing.
Sure, I can share. It's called the PHQ-4, which stands for Patient Health Questionnaire, which is very commonly delivered in hospitals. And there's 2 questions on depressive symptoms, about like hopelessness and happiness and mood, and 2 questions about anxiety, about excessive worry, and I can't remember, but there's 4 questions. You can Google it and you can find the document. It's called the PHQ-4.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome.
And you also mentioned, I want to ask you a little bit about your work with LGBTQ plus communities, but you also mentioned 5 things to do during COVID. Is that something you want to get to later, or do you want to talk about that right now?
I want to start talking. Actually, I want to talk about that now. I want to give students a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel of what they can do, and I'm going to talk about this. And I'll frame this issue as psychological survival. So in terms of what I would recommend people to maintain good mental health, keep an eye out for the first signs of deterioration, whether these are happening within you or within a friend. And the first one is activities of daily living. Are people stopping showering? Are they not eating? Are they not leaving the house? Are they not grooming themselves? Do they stink? The next one is if you notice an uptick in substance abuse, again, whether it's yourself or a friend. And a really worrisome one is withdrawal, of people that start withdrawing from their friends and hiding out. And it's very, very much human nature to do self-destructive things when we feel upset. It seems like the way we're built, like when we feel like we're mistreated, we automatically do like the last thing that we should do, like, tell off all our friends, hide out in the house, drink more. So it's really important to recognize it and push back against this. So like I said, I'm framing this as psychological survival of the pandemic. So this is not about happiness. We'll talk about happiness, but it's not about happiness. This is about getting you on the other side of this without a new mental health diagnosis or a worsened mental health diagnosis or substance abuse disorder. So your goal is to, like I said, mitigate exacerbating what's already going on for you. So it is important to keep on doing what makes you happy. That is crucial. Keep on doing that safely. But remember that it's not about happiness right now. It's about psychological self-protection. We call this resilience, meaning that you will still suffer because we are all suffering. But if you have this, you'll bounce back as opposed to suffering and breaking. So start with focus on what you have control over, because there are indeed things you have control over. And let's start really basic, like with your physical health. Without proper sleep and without proper nutrition, or with too much drugs or alcohol use, your body is going to start sending stress messages to your brain that there's something wrong with it. And these are going to compound the stress that you already have coming in from the outside world. So you're going to have less emotional fortitude to deal with what's going on if you're not taking care of the body that you're in. And it's so important to manage stress physically, to directly attack it physically. So I recommend meditation, exercise, relaxation protocols. You can go to YouTube and find, many, many relaxation protocols. If you're interested in meditation and new to it, I recommend a few things. One is an app called Headspace. I've tried all the apps, and Headspace is my favorite by far. It's worth the subscription because they explain to you why you're doing it and how to do it. And also, there's a great book called Wherever You Go, There You Are by a man named John Kabat-Zinn that really helps you get up to speed on mindfulness. So control what you have. Another part of that is creating a daily routine. The idea of taking some control back over your day, and also making sure you get out of the house safely. We don't want you ending up on the other side of this with agoraphobia, thinking the only reason you didn't die is because you stayed at home with the door closed. So get out of the house safely, and think about what else you can control, which is your actions, what you do during this time, and think about what your purpose, what your role in the pandemic is going to be. So there's, what you can take charge of. And then the next one is finding meaning in what's happening to you. There can be PTSD as a result of this, but there can also be post-traumatic growth. It's possible to have intensely negative reactions to trauma and still experience growth and not PTSD. It's possible to experience the despair and the stress and acknowledge the horror of what's happening. But if you can find meaning in it, that can hope and sustain you. Like I said, what your role is going to be in this, what good you do actually see happening around you. There's another great book by a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl called Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about how he psychologically survived the Holocaust. And I highly recommend that book if you're looking for ways to find meaning in all this. Another thing to do is connections. You're going to need to foster your connections to others. So connect to others safely. Like I said, we're social animals, and we can only be as happy as our relationships are fulfilling to us. So make sure that you're staying connected however you can safely. Also, it's a good thing to help others. Get outside of your own head, do things for other people, and your future self will judge you more kindly when you look back on what you did during this period. And like I mentioned, we have this need for novelty. So seek out novelty however you can safely. Like I said, it's our most fundamental urge to seek things. And so, find things that you can do to satisfy that. So keeping yourself safe, I was going to have switching points, is keeping yourself safe is also going to do a lot for your mental health. So you're not worrying about what you've done, what might happen as a result. And if you're suffering too much to bear, there is always treatment, and WashU does have a health center. I went to the website that says they can connect you to services or provide them directly to yourself. And like I said before many times, I've always got to add in for marginalized populations, treatment is much harder to find, harder to get, harder to come by. So then I also wanted to talk about, that was how to protect your current self. And I also want you to think in this, as you're thinking about this, about your future self, which we sometimes lose sight of. So for your future self, you're going to need to do all those things above. But one thing that you can really do is consider all your actions right now and how they might make you feel about yourself in the future. So not just how am I feeling right now and how might this affect me, but how might this affect my family or friends? Like, what if I get someone sick and they die? I'll be grieving. What if I get sick and die? How many people are going to be grieving? And how am I going to feel if somebody gets this because of me and it's very serious? Think about the medical workers who are really struggling mentally right now. And like I said, how your future self might judge your actions and the possible consequences. Really think about what's the story that you want to be able to tell about yourself in this period, and what is a story that you're going to be proud of. And that's the best way to protect yourself 5-10 years from now.
I love that. Thinking about, what's the story you want to be able to tell at the end of this? That's really important. And I'm glad that you shared these specific examples of resources for students. Several of the students commented that WashU has a student discount for Headspace. And Headspace, awesome. I think, generally has a student discount. There were several different numbers. I won't cite them because I don't know which one is right. But I think you can get it for pretty cheap for the entire year if you're a student. So using that is great. And I think, yeah, just giving students these resources, because like I said, everyone's very concerned about their mental health and how to keep themselves safe. And what you're saying is great too. Like, we can't just think about right now. One of the students was wondering if you could kind of expand on how we spread that message about it's not about happiness, it's about resilience. And I think that also kind of leads into your think about this in the long term. How are you going to feel about this when it's all over?
That's a really good question, because there is something called toxic positivity culture. And America, we've got it in spades, where you're supposed to be fine all the time. And we talk about this a lot in psychology, that what is making us most miserable as a nation is the trying to be happy all the time. So there's another resource, I can't remember. Oh, it's called The Happiness Trap. That's a resource to talk about this, about how trying to force happiness all the time is causing people to suffer. And if you can communicate to people that, if you're upset due to something that's happening and needs to be changed, that is actually healthy. And you can tell people, like, really, how are you actually doing? Like, and you can be the one to say, like, when they say, how are you doing? You'd say, like, I am not doing well today. Which is actually one of the most important things you can say to yourself or someone else. We can say, like, I'm at 60% today. That's where I'm at. I'm going to forgive myself and give myself that. So communicating about, toxic positivity can be helpful and important.
Yeah. I think that's great. And I mean, like we were saying earlier, it's good to acknowledge that this is difficult and it's not fair and all of those things.
Right.
So I do want to make sure that we have time to get to the question of the LGBTQ plus people and how they're being affected in particular by this pandemic, because students have tons of questions about this, in terms of people who returned home and their home might not be as safe or comfortable of a place as campus and those sorts of things. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So when we talk about LGBT communities, it's difficult because this is a panoply of sexual orientations and gender identities and expressions, and there's intersectionality within this and further stratification due to other identities. So people who are LGBT and also of color have very different experiences than, say, white, cisgender, LGBT people. And also due to Trump rollbacks, trans people are less protected in healthcare and in homeless shelters than they were a few years ago. But we can discuss some overall themes and then some unique populations. So first, for a lot of people, the biggest thing is that Pride was canceled. Pride is a celebration that happens in June to commemorate the Stonewall riots and the start of the gay rights movement in New York City in 1969. And in the U.S., it's moved away from being a city disrupting march to a city permitted, sanctioned parade party. But in many parts of the world, this is the one time a year where people actually get to gather in public, out, and they're actually doing something really meaningful and marching. So that's been taken away from them, and they're having to hide more as a result. So going into this, the LGBTQ communities had vulnerabilities. Again, marginalization, which also leads us with the LGBT communities. Like I was saying, we don't have enough data on the LGBT communities. Like, the CDC did not ask about LGBT in its most recent survey. In all the years of doing cancer research, we still don't have any LGBT data on cancer. So we are hurt by a lack of data. And before COVID, LGBT people already had higher risks for mental health concerns associated with stigma, mistreatment, access, and stress. LGBT people also had higher rates of chronic medical conditions that come with lack of access to care, such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, HIV/AIDS, and just basic health concerns. We also know that they're more likely to engage in risky behaviors like smoking, vaping, and other substance use that make them more vulnerable to this novel coronavirus. So you add on top of that COVID-19 has disrupted the health system. Things that are seen as elective either aren't happening or people are scared to go to the hospital. So it's harder to see the doctor for the HIV or the cancer that you're more likely to have. In addition, trans people, if they're lucky to get competent care at all, a lot of them have been put off either starting hormone treatments as well as surgeries that would confirm their gender identity. I saw on Facebook in a group that I'm in somebody who had been assigned male at birth and now identified as female, was in a lot of distress because here in Chicago we can do a lot of things, but we can't do anything in a salon or a doctor's office that requires us to take our mask off. So that means you can't get a shave, you can't get a facial, and for her it meant she couldn't get the electrolysis on her beard that she was used to, and so her beard was growing back and she couldn't get it taken care of, and so she was having extreme gender dysphoria and thoughts of suicide. And she felt like her body was betraying her. So this is one in a number of ways. And it was worse for her because she was also somebody who had no job stability. So she was saying, somebody help me find a doctor and please give me some money to do this. Another thing we know is that LGBT plus adults already experience higher rates of social isolation that can only be being exacerbated among this. So the effects so far, we don't know them. We don't have the data. One thing that I think about when I was thinking about this is college students. COVID has caused an increase in housing instability, which disproportionately affects trans youth who rely on their university address for a permanent address. And also many LGBT students rely on the university for culturally competent mental health care, as well as the student health insurance, which may often cover the hormones they need. There was one study that was done in Portugal where, they interviewed a lot of LGBT youth who were stuck at home, and 6 out of 10 said that they were uncomfortable at home, and 3 out of 10, 30% said that they were very uncomfortable and felt very unsafe at home. So that is happening right now. And then around the world, there are stories of government agencies using the pandemic as an excuse to persecute LGBT people by coming into shelters where they stay, or their NGOs that they run, or using LGBT as a villain, saying that gay people spread viruses, therefore making their lives even more dangerous than they already were.
Yeah, that's really difficult. I see in the question box that some students have shared some specific resources through WashU that we'll be sure to share on the Canvas site for everyone also. Because I think there are so many, like you said, it's hard. There are some really specific questions coming in the question box, but like you said, if we don't have the data right now, it's hard to know the extent of the problem. But certainly another area where we have people that are dealing with more than we realize and need to be showing kindness around those issues.
Yeah, and there's plenty of ways that you can help out. You can become a scientist and get us some data, please. That would be great. Also, there's so many organizations like the Trevor Project, which has so much information online and resources. So that's a resource for students as well. And almost every major city has an LGBT-focused health center, and they would love your money. They need it so badly. I don't know if they need your, I don't know if they need your volunteer time right now. If they do, that's great. But they would very much benefit from anything sent their way.
I'm glad you shared that because students are also asking what they can do to help with these issues. So I think that's really great.
Yeah, find the people that are already doing it, like these community health centers, like in Chicago, Tower Brown. Find the people who are already doing it, the leaders, and then, ask them what they need.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So, I think across the board, the struggles with mental health during this, students are wondering in terms of how they handle taking care of their own mental health and other people's mental health. Some of the questions have been like, how do I talk to someone about what I'm struggling with without feeling like I'm burdening them? Or how do I talk to someone who I'm concerned about in a way that's going to be like a positive interaction? So maybe if you could talk a little bit about this and also just kind of how we're taking care of ourselves versus other people, that sort of thing.
Right. So in terms of feeling like a burden to people, that's a misnomer. That's a mischaracterization that's been put on our culture in terms of communication. Like, how many of us actually feel burdened when a good friend that we care about comes and says, "I'm struggling"? It's very rare. It's one thing if somebody's come to you many times and you say, "Okay, you need to take this to a professional," but for the most part, most people love to help their friends and listen to them. There was another part to that question. What was it? You're saying feel like a burden?
Yeah, or how do you, if you're concerned about someone, how do you address them?
Right. Well, you got it. You got to be pretty direct. You got to say, I'm concerned with what I'm seeing. I care about you and I'm seeing that, you're getting high every night, or I can't help but see those pictures, on Instagram from the other night. But to express your concern and to say that you can relate and understand that I totally get why you're feeling this way, and say, there are resources for this. I'm a resource, but I can only do so much. But to like I said, to be direct and be empathic, and make sure that they know that you understand and care, is what I'd say. And then in terms of this question of how do we balance care for self versus others, the way that I think about it is that they're one and the same. I take care of myself to keep you healthy, and you take care of yourself to keep me healthy, physically, but also mentally. And we do this so that we can get out of this as quickly as possible. I want that to really be a message that comes through, is that the faster we get out of this, the smaller the mental health toll will be. And it's deteriorating rapidly right now. So we have to take care of ourselves, but remember that the problem is the virus, and make sure that's the focus. So if you care about your own mental and physical well-being and the health of the people you love, you should set your sights on doing what you can to stop the spread of the virus. And also to remember that marginalized people are suffering so much more. So if you're someone who cares about the lives of people of color, of LGBT people, elderly people, disabled people, you must also care about their heads and their hearts, their educations and their livelihoods. So if you think about it this way, I've come to believe that stopping the spread of the virus is a moral obligation that we all have to one another as part of a social contract.
That's so important, and that's something that we've been trying to create a community around in this class, is that we can all be part of this solution together, and that we have a support network now to do that. I want to mention that I'm seeing questions about repeating information about different resources. We'll add all of those to the Canvas page so that you can check those out. In our last couple minutes, I'm wondering if you want to speak any more about specific things that students can be doing to try and manage their anxiety at this time, particularly as they're in an intensive course that's just talking about the pandemic every day.
Right. So you got to take care of yourself. You got to let yourself go offline. That's really, really important in all this. It's important to do what you can to get a well set up system so you're informed. Like I've got my 3 or 4 news sources every morning that I read because I trust them and they're good. And that's it. That's it for the day. So it's important to let yourself go offline. It's important, like I said, to make sure you're having social connection. Make sure you're finding new and exciting things outside of this. There are intellectual pursuits that you can explore. Like I said, take care of your body. That is huge. And if you're anxious, watch what you're eating and watch what you're drinking. It's this weird thing when people get anxious for some reason, they decide they need to drink a lot of coffee. I don't know what that's about, but it's a terrible idea. So these seem maybe like trivial things, but these are really, really important. So take care of yourself. Watch what's going into you. Watch the information that you're taking in. And maintain your connections, do your meditation, get sleep. I'm trying to think what else.
I think those are all really important suggestions.
Yeah, and reach out to a therapist if you need it. I mean, they're there.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I think that in these moments of crisis, you can often forget the most basic things like drink some water.
Yes. Yeah.
So we do.
It said I forgot to eat today because I was so stressed out. And it's like, and they eat and they feel much better. Sorry, you were going to say.
That's right. We have about a minute left. Are there any last words that you'd like to tell the students? We have over 1,200 students in this class and other people from the public listening. What's a message that you'd like to leave them with?
I just really want to highlight my last message, that we have a social contract here and we have a moral obligation to care for one another. Just really want to underscore that.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's been a lot of fun. Yeah.
It's been wonderful. So thank you very much. Have a great day.
Yeah, bye.
Bye. Okay, so we are now moving into our second hour, and we are going to be talking with another guest speaker for the second hour. Our second speaker is Dr. Fenaba Addo. She is a professor at the University of Wisconsin who will be talking to us about health disparities and COVID. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Addo.
Hi, it's great to be here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you perfectly. Thank you.
Okay.
So I was hoping that we could start just with you telling us a little bit about what type of work you do generally, and then how that's shifted or become more focused during the pandemic.
Sure. So, hi, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I am a professor in the Department of Consumer Science in the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And my work, broadly speaking, examines the role of economic resources on family and households and overall well-being, so very broadly defined. And more specifically, over the last few years, actually stemming from my graduate work, I've been really interested in wealth inequality, growing wealth inequality within our society, and the role of debt. So that's DEBT, which is negative assets or liabilities, and the increasing role that has been playing in the lives of particularly young adults in the form of student loan debt, as well as other forms of unsecured consumer debt. That work has led me to explore racial disparities in student loan debt. I've also looked at the role of growing student loan debt on relationships and in households and on well-being as far as health and mental health and health outcomes. So my work has touched upon a lot of these issues, and we can spend the hours exploring questions related to that work. But as you said, more recently, obviously, with the global pandemic that's been going on, I've been exploring how inequalities, in particular economic inequalities, may be exacerbated by the current crisis that American households have found themselves in. And we can see this directly when we look at young adults with regard to and higher education. It's getting shut down in last spring, and individuals' ability to continue their studies, who's able to continue and has not been able to continue their studies as well. So is that a good overall synopsis of where I'm going?
Yep, that's perfect. So students had questions so far. More will come in as we're talking, but
sure.
So far students' questions have kind of revolved around three major themes. One being the education aspect of your work, another being unions, and then the third one being kind of like families and relationships and how money impacts that. So I want to start with the education side of things. Students were wondering, given what's happening now with this pandemic, what is going to happen to students from lower income families that may not have the ability to continue their education? They maybe were going to university with a scholarship or with some other form of help, or maybe their families were able to support them and now won't be able to because of job loss or other economic issues. How is COVID-19 impacting particularly these students that come from lower income families?
Yeah, and I'll also add, even, their families may not be able to support them, or their role in the family may have shifted to them having to support their own family, and, being in a position now that they cannot take the time off or devote 100% to their educational studies, but may have to supplement the household income with their own, by entering into the labor market. So these are very much reciprocal relationships that we think about, and how they are maybe disproportionately impact lower income households. So we think about, with regard to education, one thing that I can say from my work that we are particularly concerned about is individuals who are non-completers, or individuals who can't complete their degree and then have the debt of pursuing higher education as well, and that those impacts reverberate throughout the rest of young adulthood, and potentially throughout the rest of your adulthood. So one issue we would be concerned about is the inability to complete your studies, just knowing that the returns to one's education increase as you gain more schooling and get the degree, and the potential negative impacts of not being able to complete the degree, and start and stoppages of your educational trajectory also can impede future returns to your, when I say returns, I mean labor market returns. So we're thinking about wages and earned income in particular. I'll also say that in grouping, I like to, since I am a wealth scholar, I like to think of not just low income households, but also low wealth households as well. So how might households that don't have wealth or have a lot of debt may not be able to draw upon resources to help supplement when aid is taken away from the household, right? So normally, you can turn to, like we think of, if you want to do a comparative analysis to previous recessions, such as the Great Recession, we saw a lot of individuals, both young adults and adults who had not completed their studies, returning to higher education in order to, supplement their studies or gain additional schooling during those times when the labor market kind of contracts. But this pandemic is actually quite unique in the fact that returning to higher education might not necessarily be an option, because higher ed is also experiencing financial problems as well. So, the options that individuals have is particularly constrained at this moment, not just in the labor market, but also in higher education.
I think that's really important. And, honestly, I hadn't actually really thought as much about the fact that we talk so much about student debt, and the assumption often in those conversations is that those students have completed their degree. And you bring up this great point, which is that actually there are people who are taking on student debt and then aren't able to finish. And that's such an important consideration when we talk about these issues. And it seems like it's likely that that would increase. I don't know if there's any data on that yet for COVID, because the hypothesis would be that the number of those people would increase because of this situation. And I've heard a lot in the news about individuals, like anecdotal evidence that universities are taking away funding for students, or people are losing scholarships, things like that. Is that actually a trend that's occurring?
I think we have to wait and see a little bit longer, because we do have like the anecdotal stories, but there are a lot of places that are being quite inventive with how they're trying to supplement and support students in this moment. It's just, we don't know the magnitude of and the amount of help that they're going to be able to provide. So, I think we really have to wait and see to see how this will play out eventually, and where who will be most impacted by some. So I think I will say that I think it's probably going to differ, right? There's a lot of heterogeneity, there's a lot of variation in our higher education system. And so, it will be contingent on the types of institutions that individuals attend, and largely related to the types of institutions that they attend. Yeah,
that's important. And I think maybe you could talk a little more about what it is that we could be doing to support those students in this moment, because you said we don't know yet the effect. That's actually been a theme throughout this course, whether we're talking about the virus itself or these social issues. The data just aren't there yet for us to analyze. But if we are trying to proactively prevent or try and deal with this issue, what are some things that could be done at a government level, at a university level, and even at an individual level? The students are always asking what they can do to help in these situations.
Wow, that's a great question. Let me see, where can I start with regard to help? So I'll say, when I do this work, I like to think about different populations, right? And how, and different points in the trajectory of higher education. So we have the accumulation piece of the accumulation of the debts, which is usually happening when students are enrolled in an institution of higher learning, and then there's the repayment piece. And so a lot of times, and often the conversation that has currently been around student loan debt and the student loan crisis has been on the repayment piece, because of high rates of default and delinquency that are plaguing a lot of people, and we see like this ballooning debt, and who's struggling the most with repayment. The accumulation piece hasn't received that much concentration, and I'm speculating here, but we may see this shift a little bit with regard to the crisis. And so I'm talking about pre-COVID, but now because of what populations may be impacted differentially by the ability to pay for your studies, right? So that being said, there are several pieces, and you've pointed them out quite correctly. There's the ability of funding from government, either both state and federal government, that are providing resources to institutions to help supplement financial aid. Then there's the school's ability to provide support for students, and then there's families' ability to provide support for students. I honestly think it's, if we think at the very micro level of families and households who are facing constraints that kind of tie to our first question and conversations, it will be difficult, to decide, if I have the money now, if your parents may have lost, if we're talking specifically to young adults, if our parents may have lost, unemployed or furloughed, to be able to support their children in going to college. I also say a lot of students, independent of COVID, many of them are paying their way through college. So they may be accumulating debt, but they also are paying their way for college. So there may just be a shifting in the percentages of how much work hours they're going to be putting into the labor market in order to supplement their college tuition costs. And what that might translate to in the long run is a prolonging time to degree, right? So if you can't take on a lot of credits, because you're working, that may increase the amount of time you spend in completing your degree. That being said, there's I was going to say there may be no rush to go into the labor market right now, but that's not a very good joke to make. But just thinking about it, and so far as that is concerned, what we also want to think about when we think about it, but at the institutional level, their ability to accept more students, right? So I know I can speak a little bit more, I guess, to the graduate level, which may be some interest to some students. I know some places for whom they've decided that they want to invest more in their current students and are not going to be taking on new students because of the uncertainty around future fiscal funding and the ability to support students. Usually universities, when they accept grad students, it's a multi-year contract. So there's uncertainty around that. So I think what this pandemic has laid bare is, the multi layers of how higher ed funding has happened, and what uncertainty means for planning long term, right? So it significantly hinders the ability to plan long term, and there's a lot of trade-offs that had to have happened in the short run to kind of navigate this space, and we're doing it, constantly right now at a very, very micro level within our families and households. But these decisions are also happening at a more macro level, at the institutional level as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Those questions that you mentioned about graduate students taking on more versus not, that's something that we're discussing in our department. The reality is that there's not unlimited funding, and so you have to make difficult decisions about these things.
Absolutely. And not want to lose the integrity or the quality of programming and schooling and everything that we deliver, the experience, right, to the students that are going to be, be enrolling and pursuing their studies.
Absolutely. So related to that, some students have been asking questions about how your choice of school may impact this, your ability to finish or the support that you get. And I wanted to ask about that because something interesting, I had always been in the state school system for my education. And when I came to WashU, I realized that, I think a common misconception that people have is that if you're from a lower income family, you don't have the ability to go to a fancy private school, for example. And actually those schools have pockets of money specifically to help certain students that apply that qualify to get in. So are there any general trends in where students apply or who can offer better support, or things that are relevant to this idea of being able to finish and accumulating debt, those types of things?
Yeah, so I'll say two things about this. One, and when thinking about my answer to your question, one is that I believe about 10% of the overall undergraduate population is enrolled in these private institutions, right? Most undergraduates attend large public institutions. So a lot of times in the media, they tend to get a lot of more focused private institutions, but most individuals are going to large public institutions, and that's where most of the teaching and research is happening. I say that to say because what that means is that a lot of the more innovative and kinds of financial aid packages that you're speaking of or leaning towards are happening at these institutions that are only educating a small percentage of the overall undergraduate population. Also, I'm going to borrow an analogy that I heard in another webinar that I did a couple of months ago, in which the gentleman said that higher ed pricing has now really moved away from like a one-size-fits-all model to more like airline pricing. So you don't know, or you don't know what the person sitting next to you might be paying. It's highly variable depending on one's financial background and the school's ability to work with you and in your different circumstances. And that's something I think which is it's universal across most institutional public or private. And as far as them being able to help you, it's usually this combination of both grants, aid. I've, in my estimation, a little too much aid, a little too much loan-based aid and not enough grant aid. But you do see like packages varying quite significantly across students, even within the same institution as well.
Yeah, that's good to know. So to kind of meld from the education into the union questions, a student had a question about how we've heard a lot about teachers being concerned about going back into the classroom because of safety, and that maybe teachers' unions could be used as a way for them to vocalize their concerns. And so the student was kind of wondering, what is the role of unions right now in this particular pandemic? And there are some additional questions from students just kind of trying to understand better. Are unions being reinvigorated? Is it a useful way to try and take care of safety precautions, those sorts of things?
Oh, wow, these are all great questions. I'm a little hesitant to answer this. I only because I'm not a labor economist per se, but what I can speak to with regard to this question, which I think is definitely important, is that and recognize from these questions that students are realizing that there is a loss of bargaining power in specific industries, and unions really used to be this source of power that employees had made for moments like this. And we've really seen a rollback in unions across multiple industries. Teachers actually, are one of the few professions that still actually have pretty strong unions, but even they have lost some power. I think that's all I'll say about that, because I'm just not quite sure, and I don't want to speculate or go down a road that I really am not that quite not that knowledgeable about. But yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
That's fair.
Yeah.
So one of the clarifying questions that students have, and I should say up front that I know nothing about economics or business. So it's a good point. My phrasing of questions may be off. They're asking the difference between wealth and income, and I think it's a great question. Also,
that's a great question. Yes, yeah, no, absolutely. And oftentimes when I get in front of audiences or classrooms, I should give basic definitions of what income. So income is a flow into the usually it's very basic, is a flow into the household. We usually divide it into earned income, which is income that's coming from labor or salaried or wages, or unearned income, which is usually still a flow, but it could be like stock dividends, capital gains, even rental income that you may get from an investment property that you own. Wealth is considered a stock at a very basic level. It is the difference between the total value of one's assets minus the total value of one's liabilities or debts. As wealth scholars, we always strive to underscore that wealth means so much more than just that. It's not just the value of one's total assets minus their debts, but it represents, particularly within our society, access to resources. So the wealthier you get, the more access you have to resources within our society in multiple realms: education, healthcare, political power, social power. And that is really why we strive within multiple disciplines, sociology, economics, psychology, to underscore how important growing wealth inequality has been within our society, because it's also reflective of access to resources.
And related to that, students were hoping you could talk a little bit about race and wealth and wealth inequality.
Sure. I mean, you can give more specific questions, or I mean, or any particular, because that's a whole huge hours and hours of study to talk about. But,
so if you had to just give us an introduction of, here's the thing.
This exists. Yeah, there's large racial, so wealth inequality in our society is large. Racial wealth inequality is significantly large. So as of the most recent data that we have, we should be getting some more recent data based from 2019 data, but right now we have the best wealth data is based on 2016, so it's a little further. A couple years ago, Black households had about the 10th of the wealth of the median wealth of white households within our society. So the median white household had about $171,000 worth of net worth, and Black households had about $17,600 of median net wealth. So very different. Like the distributions are completely, kind of don't even hardly cross over when we look at them visually. What we also want to underscore is that racial wealth inequality is large and it's persistent, and it's persistent across generations, so intergenerational. And with these inequalities stem from historical legacies of public policies that denied wealth building opportunities to Black households, and even actively stole wealth or wealth theft from communities of color throughout our history. And so the work that I do and many scholars out here have highlighted how inequality has persisted across generations, and what particular social and economic factors have served to perpetuate it and have it persist across generations in particular.
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're touching on there is related to one of the student questions also about how housing and access to loans, for example, those would be some examples.
That's
then,
exactly,
right?
that's usually the goal, I would say gold standard or classic example of how wealth inequality happened, or, persistent racial wealth inequality happened. You can speak to like the GI Bill after World War II, in which many returning soldiers, white soldiers, were able to use those loans in order to purchase homes, and those same that same use of the GI Bill was denied Black soldiers who had fought in World War II. And so, and then we also see it in the mortgage market. So facing discrimination in the mortgage market meant either you were denied loans for getting a household, or were given predatory or high interest loans, so that the amount that you paid over time was a lot more. And then there's even more recent examples of difference in appraisal rates regarding home ownership, the ability, maybe same size houses in different neighborhoods getting appraised very differently, just due to differences in proximity to neighborhoods that have larger proportions of black families and households.
Yeah, and students are wondering, what can be done to address these issues? Like one of the students was asking, are there other countries that have handled these issues differently than the United States? Can we learn anything from other countries, or are there recommendations that scholars like yourself are making for how we could handle these issues?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I guess I'm hesitant to say about other countries that have done anything that I can think of, in a way that we want to highlight at the moment. I will say that if something comes to mind, I'll bring it back. I'll see what I can say. I will say that oftentimes, in order to deal with issues of large-scale, institutional differences of discrimination and racism, racist systems, we tend to have to lean on the system, right? So how policy or public policies as mechanisms to address the issue, like waiting for individuals to change and be better, and in particular, given the institutionalized nature of the problem. is probably, is usually the way that we scholars tend to think of is the way to go. I'll say one of the I think more promising policies that has been proposed and has been talked quite a bit in the last few months, I'm not sure if your students are aware, is this idea of baby bonds or opportunity accounts. So it's a wealth-based policy measure, excuse me, that would entrust individual families when a child is born with basically like a trust, like a financial trust that would grow at the rate of just normal inflation over time. And as the child grew and reached age 18, they would have this stock of money that would help them to use either towards their college education, entrepreneurship or self-employment, just kind of both addressing wealth inequality. So, and it's honestly, it's actually not in its original conception a race-based policy. It's a wealth-based policy, but given the disproportionality of race and inequality of wealth in this society, it may end up disproportionately helping low-income Black households in particular. But I think what's important about it is that it speaks to the intergenerational nature of how wealth persist across generations, because families are able to help their children, not just through, I think a lot of the misconceptions that people get wealthy through inheritances, so they inherit a whole stock of money, but that's not just how wealth inequality persists, right? We know it persists because of assistance that individuals get throughout pivotal points in their lifetime. So maybe the assistance with paying for college, assistance with help with the down payment for a house or a car, or being able to even to move back home with your parents after school, after finishing your studies, and being able to not have to pay rent for a couple of years, either in paying off your student loans or saving up for a down payment. So just those safety nets, those private safety nets that wealth offers are important. And I think that this opportunity accounts or baby bonds proposal speaks to those kinds of mechanisms in a way that others I haven't quite heard of have spoken to them.
Yeah, I think that's great. Can you explain a little bit more about that in terms of where does that money come from? Because I think that's one question that students have in trying to understand, like the aid packages and things like that, is for these ideas that are being proposed, where does the money come from? How does that impact individuals that would have to pay taxes or something like that?
Oh, okay. So it's like from family, but you mean like how does the government, how would the
I
government
think
fund a system like that?
Yeah, for the baby bonds in particular, like where would the money come from for that?
So, I mean, there's multiple proposals of ways that this particular policy could get funded, but it would be if it's a federal program, it would come from the federal system.
Okay, great. I think I understand. Sorry if my questions are naive. Also, I think you may have frozen. Are you still with us?
No.
Is this just... Am I freezing or are you freezing? Oh, are you there? I think you froze for a second.
Okay. I'm good now. Are you okay?
You're good?
I'm good.
Okay.
I'm good.
Okay, great. Thank you. I wasn't sure if it was my computer or your computer. Okay, great. So I think this idea, like students are saying in the question box, I love baby bonds and things like that. So I think it's a great opportunity to have these discussions about things that could be really great even outside of the pandemic, but the pandemic brings to light the fact that we need to be doing these things. So are there specific ways that you think maybe the pandemic has exposed these issues that hopefully we now have people that are aware and therefore supporting these solutions?
I mean, I think, yes. To answer your question, I think that the pandemic has brought the issues of economic inequality, just by what I have viewed in the news and media cycle, the amount of interest in this topic and the work that I've been doing. So yes, I think it is, people are understanding the importance. I think, and I may have said this earlier, I'm sorry if I can't quite remember, I think what is also highlighting is because of how the pandemic, because of the source of this current economic downturn, it being a health health base, or this global pandemic, this pandemic, and how in order to, we, in the very early months or the really early weeks, we didn't know about transmission. We didn't know, where it was coming from and how deadly it was going to be. It led to this shutdown of the economy and the inability of people to earn a living. So when we think about the number of households within our society that have to rely on a paycheck or living paycheck to paycheck within their households, then it leads to, well, what happens if that gets stopped, right? And so we did see this, the CARES Act, which served to address many of these, short-term economic hardships that families and households were going to meet, but it also gave it a timeline, right? It gave it, so at the end of, as for example, prior to last week, a lot of the student loan, the federal student loan, was going to just be suspended at the end of September, for example. But we didn't know, if the economy was going to be back up again, and if many of these households who may have been struggling to pay their debts would have been back to earning a living as well. So, insofar as that we don't know the end of when this uncertainty is going to end, when the vaccine will become available. There's a lot of uncertainty around that and the ability of people to earn a living. So how do we support households and families in a society with very few social safety nets? We have decided that we need to rely on private safety nets, right? And so private safety net, what is the number one private safety net in our society? Is wealth. So how do you turn, where do you turn? Where is that your source of economic security and stability? It's the wealth in your households. And then it becomes a really dim picture when you see the amount of wealth inequality or number of households that have very low wealth or a lot of debt in these moments.
Yes.
So I think that's led to the focus on what are we doing? How are we dealing with households when there is not other social safety net supports within our society?
Absolutely. So students were wondering, is it, when you're trying to deal with these differences, this wealth gap, is the best course of action to deal with that increasing the number of jobs, or is it increasing the minimum wage for what people are getting paid for those jobs? Because the students have some questions about if that's a trade-off, right? If you're going to increase the minimum wage, does that then mean that you can't employ as many people, and which one causes a bigger issue for wealth gaps?
These are great questions. Again, great questions. There's actually quite a bit of now really good empirical support to show that increasing the minimum wage does not necessarily reduce the number of jobs. Using a lot of quasi-experimental or natural experiments showing when wages changed across different states to kind of get at identifying how differences in minimum wage requirements affected employment rates. I will say also that the nature of, I'm going to try to bring it back a little bit to COVID, the nature of the COVID pandemic, in which people actually could not work, right? Who were unable to work, really brought into, caused our society to ask some larger questions around work, right? And how are we going to force individuals to work in a moment where they can't work, right? So, and the nature of work, how should people be earning a living in a society if you're not able to work? Or how are we going to get money to individuals if we're not allowing them to earn a living? So it really did raise some broader questions around the ability to work. I will say also in non-COVID times, we don't have perfect employment, right? We still have a lot of people, there are high rates of unemployment, people who are discouraged and out of the labor force for lots of reasons, right? And there's a lot of people who work hard to kind of draw them back into the labor market, but also understanding that there are long-term issues with regard to trying to get at full employment, and thinking about innovative ways that we can provide jobs to people who want to work, right? So I'm just saying that in even outside of the COVID crisis or before the COVID crisis, there were a lot of people asking questions around how do we get people to work who want to work, who are willing to work, and why isn't our society, who prior to COVID was doing, had pretty low unemployment. We were experiencing one of the longest economic recoveries in modern day history. There were still significant numbers of people who were unemployed and unable to find work. So this, I think, as we've been saying, like this ongoing theme about exacerbating inequalities, but actually having us ask these really basic and fundamental questions around what we think about earning a living, what it means to work, and how and what people should be paid for, and how we're going to deliver resources to households when they are unable to work.
Are there some best practices around that, like things that are really helpful for getting people who want to work into jobs?
So I'm trying to, let me think of the best way to answer that question. That's a great question. That question delves a lot into different belief systems around markets. And so, do we think that, the current system of a free market in which, private, there are enough private employers to employ all the people who need work are able to operate in a way that they can employ all those people? That's really the question, right? And so there were competing ideologies around the ability of the private market to do so, and so there's some people that believe that there are, and that we just need to adjust certain wages or compensation and so on and so forth. And then there are people who believe that there are not enough jobs if we just rely on the private sector, and therefore the public sector needs to supplement the number of jobs in our society. And so looking towards how the federal government or local state government can provide additional opportunities for people who are unable to find work in the private sector. Yeah, does that answer your question? Sorry, I was trying to think of it.
No, I do. Yes, for sure. I should have forewarned you.
Yes.
The secret thing about this course is that it's how to in 50 minutes give answers to questions that really take a lifetime to answer.
We're doing a history of work and inequality in the United States.
That's right. I mean, you're doing a great job, and
okay.
the reality is it's a very complicated situation, and we don't have all the answers, particularly about how COVID is interacting with these historical issues within our society.
Absolutely.
So students are asking some questions to ask a little bit more about this idea of the minimum wage and jobs, and are wondering, does it mean then that the price of products increase? I mean, it sounds to me from your last answer like part of the answer is that we actually need to not be relying on individual businesses, privately owned businesses, that there are other places that people could be getting jobs. But given the current situation, I mean, does it necessarily mean then that prices will increase?
So I'm just going to make sure I'm following the chain. So if employers have to raise or employ more people at a higher amount, then it translates and is passed through to the consumer. Is that
exactly?
I would say that it depends, and that there are ways that there are. I believe most of the times the cutbacks tend to happen in research and innovation, and not necessarily pass through directly to the customer. So that's oftentimes where we see first where businesses tend to reduce their investments, and and that's not where we want them necessarily to reduce their investments, because research and innovation is how we get new products and stuff out there. If they have to start raising prices, that leads to shifts in demand, and so businesses more often than not will try to reduce the amount of costs that are passed through to consumers. Absolutely.
Yeah. The students were also asking what they can do. So one of the questions is about what they can do in terms of helping to spread information about wealth gaps and their effect on our society and in this pandemic in particular. So let's start with that one. Do you have any, like, it's hard to say a simple message about this, but if you're trying to start these conversations with family members who don't have access to this sort of information or friends, what are some good places to start?
Yeah, I mean, I think at a very basic level, like kind of like how I say I often start when I'm giving a lecture or talking with in front of new audiences, is drawing the distinction between the two and kind of explaining how the trends over time or across our society, and then being really clear or about how it is generated within our society. We tend to fall oftentimes on individual tropes of dysfunction related to people's inability to save and not hold on to their wealth, but we actually have very good examples and evidence with regard to how wealth accumulation has been hindered over time through specific policies, that's which I was highlighting before, and mechanisms such as discrimination in the credit markets and the housing markets and labor markets. So this is related to income, but one thing that we do know is that Black college graduates tend to have higher rates of unemployment and underemployment, which means having a job that doesn't require a college degree. They have consistently higher rates of underemployment and unemployment over the last 2 decades. And this was during economic booms and downturns, the Great Recession, than any other group within our society. So, and as I said, that translates more into, that's labor market and it's income, but income, the ability to to earn a living, is tied to one's ability to both consume and save, right? So really thinking about why that is. We also know from like the work that I've done that independent of having a college degree or educational attainment, Black borrowers have higher amounts of student loan debt, right? So thinking about how the underlying wealth distribution may be contributing to that, but may also be in the long term inhibiting the ability to accumulate assets across your own life because you're paying down large amounts of debt over a longer period of time.
I think that's so
drawing
helpful.
upon examples like that we know, and we have really good examples to show and provide ways, and that this has persisted within our society is definitely one way. Being armored with the facts and the work to be able to say what is actually happening here. Because I think, because I was going to say, because one of the things I say to my students and to others is that when we start using those examples and we start thinking about them this way, then we can turn to policy-based solutions. And when we rely on individualized tropes around these issues, then it absolves us from having to provide a systemic response, a policy-based response to analyzing what might be actually going on and addressing the issues.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I'm sorry I kept interrupting you. I'm just really jazzed about one of the examples that you gave, which is, this idea that there's data that show that Black college graduates are unemployed or underemployed. And it's pieces like that, I think, that really help us to further separate out issues from socioeconomic disparities versus racial disparities. And this came up also in a previous lecture by a medical doctor who was talking about health disparities, and the students asked what of it is associated with race and what of it is associated with socioeconomic factors. And he said across all socioeconomic groups, Black patients are dealing with more issues around health disparities than white patients. So again, I think it's really great to kind of show that we can use data to separate out these different factors. And while they do have intersections, there are also things that we can clearly point out about specific groups.
Absolutely, yeah.
So students are also asking, in addition to raising awareness, which I think you just helped all of us do a lot, are there other things that they could actively be doing to try and stop wealth inequality?
I think it's hard to be honest. I think, we need smart, sharp young adults who are tooling themselves with um, the right analytical and critical analysis skills to move into positions of influence within our society. Like, I think, however you view this moment in your life, be it, your job, your focus, your concentration, focus on tooling up, and um, and and using your spheres of influence that you have at this moment um, to raise awareness, so that, because this is just one stop or one part of a very long, hopefully a very long life. And I know many of you will go into um, will be in positions of influence and have lots of influence over other individuals, and be making hard decisions with regard to a lot of these issues that we're thinking about today, and talking about even over the course of this course that you're taking, and and how do you use this information, how do you use this data, is important. Using research and data. The research is out there, the data is out there. How do you use it? How do you use the research? Honestly, you could start practicing now, or I would say practicing, but using the information and data now. There's a lot of people who want to use information and data in wrong and nefarious ways, but how are you using the data? How are you using the research to further inform others and yourself, so that when the opportunity comes, you're ready. You're ready, and you're implementing. I think that's one of the most important is when the opportunity arises, are you going to be ready and tooled with the proper skills to be able to meet the challenge, to meet the moment.
That's great. I think also related to that, students are interested in if there's certain policies, like certain types of policies that they should be paying attention to, particularly, we're in an election year, when they're thinking about the candidates that they want to support. Are there certain types of policies or certain language for policies that if they're interested in these types of issues, they're paying attention to?
Sure. So I'll give an example from my work that I can speak to a little bit more. So as I said, I like to think about student loan debt in both the accumulation and the repayment piece. So a lot of discussion happens in the repayment piece, and a lot of discussion has been around how do we reduce default and delinquency. And there's been a lot of talk around income-based repayment or income-driven repayment plans, and in particular, the public student loan forgiveness program, which I'm not sure if you're aware, most people who applied were denied. So, and that was a really important program because, in effect, it was meant to encourage individuals to enter into careers that are known to have a little lower income, but with the understanding that your time spent in these professions, your investment in this career, you would be relieved of your debt, right? And so we're coming out of almost 10 years since the program was implemented, and most people are having issues or struggling to get approval to get their debt absolved. This is heartbreaking, and something that we need to think about. So in the realm of student loan debt, that's what I'm looking to see. How are people talking about because how are we going to assist and help individuals who made the investment, who believed in a policy that was implemented by our federal government to help individuals pursue their dreams of maybe pursuing a career that they know it's not going to be maybe particularly financially lucrative, but is something that they really wanted to do and invest in. So it doesn't necessarily have to be student loan debt, but if there is something that is of particular interest to you, how are the different parties, different politicians talking and addressing these issues, and are they viewing it with the same intensity and with purpose than that you are? One of the things I'll say about income-based repayment, I often go around saying, yes, it's there. It's a lot of people have signed up for it, but it's an opt-in program, meaning you have to sign up for it and reapply and show proof every year. There's a lot of evidence from behavioral economics that opt-out programs actually increase people's ability to use the program. So thinking about, who are providing some innovative ways of how to increase people's ability to use a particular program. Are programs out there being designed in a way that increases the likelihood that the people that are most vulnerable or the people that need them have access to them? Because it's all good if there's a program there, but if no one's using it or don't have access to the program, then then that's something we want to talk about and address and address. So I think
Absolutely.
these are kind of the things that we think about with inequality, in particular with regard to economic insecurity. Like if people are facing financial problems, are there the ways that they are going to be able to access the program easy, or are they able to access them in a way that's going to be that allows them to access them and use the program if it was meant for them?
Absolutely, that's very important. I think everything that you've told us today has been extremely important and also really useful for us to think about moving forward. So we're at the end of our time. I just want to ask you one last question. If you can leave the students with a bit of advice as we go into this fall, what would you say to them?
Oh, yes. Bit of advice, I guess I'll just share what I'm sharing with my students is that I think your priority at this moment, given everything that's happened over the course of the last few months within our society, should be protecting and prioritizing your mental and physical wellness and well-being. Your professors and support and instruction staff are going to help you the best way they can to navigate and do the best work that you can within the coursework, and that is our job. Your priority is ensuring that your mental and physical wellness remains your priority. I heard a little bit of the last session, and he was right on point talking about all the ways in which the pandemic has served to kind of deteriorate our mental wellness. And so I think given the continued uncertainty, we cannot downplay the importance of protecting and prioritizing our well-being, our mental well-being.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for this presentation. It's been wonderful to have you.
Yeah, thank you. No problem. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, for everyone else, I will see you tomorrow. And until then, stay safe.